Welcome, everyone. This is John Windhausen, Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this next webinar called Analyzing NTIA's Changes to the BEAD State Challenge Process. And I know that's a mouthful for a title for this webinar, but this could be one of the more important, perhaps the most important webinar that we've had, because we are going to provide you with some essential information about how the BEAD challenge process is going to work, with a particular focus on anchor institutions, of course, as Shelby's mission, but also our mission is broader than just the anchor institutions. We want everybody to have high quality and affordable broadband, and the BEAD program is the largest federal investment in bringing broadband to everybody that we've ever had. So this process of identifying the challenge, identifying those locations that will be eligible for funding is going to really help determine how states allocate their funding and award funding. So this is going to be critically important. We're pleased to say that we have three experts from the state vantage point and from the federal vantage point that are going to help us decipher NTIA's recent guidance, which we will get into in just a minute. Before we jump in, just reviewing a few logistics, we want to thank you again for tuning into this webinar, which is made possible by the support of our corporate sponsors, ENA by Zayo, I should say, and Broadband.money. All audience members are muted, but we do encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions or provide comments or provide your own information through the chat box. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Shelby website tomorrow. And we also encourage you to use social media to promote the availability of this webinar. So you can do so online by tweeting at the Shelby Coalition or using the hashtag Shelby Webinars. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Diane Lindstrom, who is president of Los Lobos Consulting. And then second, we'll have Judd Carey, who is the Assistant Attorney General for Broadband in the Colorado Attorney General's office. And Judd, I think this is true. You may be the only person in the country with that title, Assistant Attorney General for Broadband. So that's pretty special. And then third, we'll hear from Shannon Williams-Mitchum, who is Vice President of Public-Private Partnerships at Ready.net. So before I turn it over to Diane, let me just provide a little bit of introductory context, a little bit more. So on June 28th, about 1 month ago, NTIA released its final guidance for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program State Challenge Process. So the program's rules require that each state and territory include a BEAD challenge process in its initial proposal, which should do by the end of this year. In that challenge process, a unit of local government, a nonprofit organization, or an internet service provider may challenge whether a location or community anchor institution is eligible for BEAD funding. So individuals cannot mount these challenges, but organizations can. The final guidance that NTIA just released is intended to help states and territories design and implement their BEAD challenge processes, and it includes a model for how a state or territory may choose to meet those program requirements. NTIA sought comment on the draft guidance in April or May. 61 organizations filed comments, including Shelby, and we were pretty pleased that NTIA accommodated some of our requests, particularly with respect to anchor institutions, which we're going to talk about today. If you want to see yourself a copy of the final guidance issued by NTIA, you can go to internetforall.gov and look for the BEAD state challenge process. But just keep in mind, this guidance document does not contain all of the rules and regulations. The guidance document supplements, but does not replace the BEAD NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity that was issued in 2022. But ultimately, the goal of all of this process and the BEAD challenge process is to ensure that eligible entities, meaning the states, can identify the full universe of locations that will be eligible for BEAD funding. The BEAD NOFO and the guidance allows eligible entities to use the national broadband map as a starting point. And that's a really important point that NTIA said. They're required by statute to use the FCC's national broadband map, but that doesn't have to be the final answer. It's a starting point to identify the list of BEAD eligible locations within their jurisdiction prior to conducting a challenge process. And the challenge process has to be set up in volume 1 of the initial proposal, that eligible entities, again, meaning the states, will identify unserved locations, underserved locations, and eligible community anchor institutions within their jurisdiction. So with that bit of background, I'm very pleased to turn the microphone over to Diane Lindstrom. As I said, as president of Los Lobos Consulting and has been active with New Mexico State Broadband Authority for some time. So Diane, very pleased to turn the mic over to you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, John. I'm very pleased to be here. As John said, I am the president of Los Lobos Consulting, a broadband consulting firm, and I am the former deputy director of the Office of Broadband Access and Expansion in New Mexico. I also worked before that for the New Mexico Public School Facilities Authority and worked on a statewide education network, moving that forward and making sure that it progresses so that we have that in the state of New Mexico. Many of you know that New Mexico is underserved and unserved and is a very rural state. So it is, we work very hard. The Office of Broadband is very new. Also, it's only been established and has staff for about a year, and it is still very much understaffed. So in our discussion, the red lines for the challenge process, as John said, were recently released, and I will put the exact URL for that in the chat after I talk with you. So why is the definition of community anchor institutions important? The NTIA requires and will fund 1 gigabit per second symmetrical internet service to each identified community anchor institute, CAI. Each state has to indicate the existing service speed, if there is any internet service, at the CAI in the initial proposal, and I believe that's in volume 1. And then each state has to certify that every unserved location, every underserved location has been served by the BEAD funding, and then the CAI locations can start to be served using that funding. So in priority, unserved is number 1, underserved is number 2, CAIs are number 3. So that's one of the things that is a little disconcerting, doesn't make all of us terribly, terribly happy. And since we all know the allocations for BEAD now for each of our states, certainly many states are in the same boat as New Mexico. We know that we don't have enough funding for all of the unserved and underserved. So reaching the CAIs is going to be a whole new endeavor. We'll have to find funding for that. So the definition of CAI from the NTIA is not specific, but there is guidance. And Judd is going to go into much more detail on that. And as Assistant Attorney General, I believe he's the correct person to talk to us about legal definitions. So the timeline for the challenges is very interesting, and that's part of what we believe we got more definition on with these red lines. So the challenge timeline is determined by each state, but will last no longer than 120 days. Tribes, municipalities, nonprofits, and internet service providers may challenge locations and community anchor institutions. So they can say this isn't really a location, or this isn't really an anchor institution, or they can say we already serve this at the speed that's required. Challengers will have a minimum of 14 days to submit challenges, and ISPs will have at least 14 days to rebut a challenge. So 14 days seems awfully short, but that's a minimum on both sides. So hopefully each state will think about that very carefully, because 14 days is really not very much time. And I am very concerned, both from a state perspective and a consulting perspective, that 14 days is not long enough. The final determinations of the challenges must be posted at least 60 days before grants from the BEAD funding are awarded. So that's very specific and very definitive. So each state will have to do that. So the process that New Mexico has been following to define CAIs has been interesting and fairly informal. It's not finalized yet. We're working with a large consulting firm to do a lot of the data analysis and figure things out. New Mexico's mapping team has been extraordinarily good and have done a lot of challenges to the FCC mapping that have been accepted and got quite a large chunk of money more than we would have gotten without those challenges being submitted and accepted. So we're very, very pleased with our mapping group. And so working together with this large consulting company, our mapping team is going to learn how to communicate with the NTIA, learn how to interpret what they're asking for, and be able to present the data in the manner that they want. So what we're looking at in New Mexico is every public governmental building that includes municipal courthouses, county courthouses, detention centers, municipal administration buildings, county administrative buildings, libraries. The libraries need to be either in the E-rate program or belong to the American Library Association. Schools, which are public, charter, private schools, any school that's in the E-rate program or has an NCES ID. Public health offices, senior centers, multi-generational centers, police stations, fire stations, all state government buildings, community gathering sites. And in some of our very, very small communities that are not actual villages or towns or cities, they may only have like a dollar store, which I know is amazing in a country like the US, but we do seem to have a dollar store everywhere. Some of our little towns only have a post office, and it's a trailer, a mobile home that is the post office. And a lot of our very little communities only have a gas station. So that would be the Community Anchor Institute. We're also looking at hospitals, health clinics, VA centers, mental and behavioral health centers, any place where people gather for healthcare. All of our higher education institutes, which are universities, community colleges, junior colleges, and any institution that has an NCES ID that has a check mark in the college category. We're also looking at public housing organizations. We're looking at any of the nonprofits that work with public housing organizations, and if they have public meetings and bring people together. We're looking at job training centers. We're looking at veterans organizations. We're looking at religious gathering sites in New Mexico. Those are churches, temples, tabernacles, and other religious gathering places. All of the community gathering sites in the smallest unincorporated rural areas. And so we talked about that a little bit. That would include perhaps dollar stores. And we, of course, have to make sure that we have the evidence and that we present that in a way that the NTIA understands that that's the only place that people come together in that community. We have a unique concern in New Mexico, and that's our tribes, our sovereign nations. We have 23 sovereign nations in New Mexico. We have 33 counties. So in our sovereign nations, each one, as the name says, is sovereign, and we are consulting with each individually. We have made sure that each tribe is thinking about these things and helping us understand what they want and what they need. What we've come up with so far in consultation with our sovereign nations is each tribal government administrative building, each tribal police station, each tribal fire station, On the Navajo Nation, the chapter houses, which are a governmental building, each tribal school, each BIA school, which is a federal school, each senior center, each veteran center, each public housing organization. Some of the pueblos want internet access at their religious sites, but most do not. And so that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, what they want and what they ask for when they ask for funding. So our process in New Mexico to get to understanding what a community anchor institution is was reading the BEAD NOFO and reading it probably more than once. I know I have read it a lot of times. Listening to the NTIA discussions, attending all of their virtual meetings, asking lots of questions. And then we also, the state office has meetings with NTIA officials all of the time. We meet with FPO weekly and sometimes more often than weekly. Inside the broadband office, there have been short brainstorming sessions, and then the team brainstorms with stakeholders, the various stakeholders, which include the sovereign nations, as I said, communities, counties, and ISPs, and then all the other stakeholders, the nonprofits, other organizations that are concerned about broadband and their access to it. So the NTIA requirements for defining CAIs, we'll be going through that a little bit more with Judd. And so now I'd like to share the screen. And this is going to take just a second. First, I'd like to show you the FCC map, that the one that is presently the accepted map. And I think it's going to take just a second for that to come up. I hope that you can see it now. And what I wanted to show you, of course, you see in the background, the dark blue, the light blue dots, and those are the served and underserved. What I wanted to show you is that you can search by address, you can search locations, providers, areas, and you can download this. The other map that I would like to show you, and I'm going to move this just a little bit, I hope. So what I need to do, okay. So let me stop sharing and then I'll share again, because I need to get to my other map. There we go. And then I'm going to show you the New Mexico map, where we show the unserved and the underserved and the CIAs. There we go. And I'm sorry, it's taking me just a second. My mail is popping up in my way, sorry. It's taking me just a second. So here we go. And I will zoom in a little bit on this so that you can see. And so on this, you see the light tan, I call them pink dots. We'll see on the legend, those are the unserved. The light blue dots, the blue areas, light blue areas are underserved. And then the dark blue areas are served. And that is 100 down and 20 up served. And I believe most of those locations we will find are fiber locations already. And then I'm going to take us to the CAI layer. Where we have some of our CIAs are already being shown and some are not yet. So here you can see, and I'll zoom out again. And it takes a minute to populate, but you can see our libraries, mobile book stops, our medical health care, our schools, our public safety locations, our higher education institutes. So you can see in just this part of New Mexico, which happens to be the eastern, southeastern quadrant, where we have the Mescalero Apache reservation in the mountains there, we have a lot identified. So this is how New Mexico is doing it. And each one of these are on a different layer on the map so that you can show them or not show them. So it's very easy to search. John, I believe that's my time. And so thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Diane, very much. I have a couple of questions for you, but I'll
Sure.
wait till after our next speakers deliver their presentations, and I'll be coming back to you about your state map. That's very impressive. Judd Carey, go ahead and take it from here.
Okay. There we go. Hopefully I'm sharing. That was really interesting, Diane, especially about the tribal efforts. And Colorado has tribal territories too. So I may be giving you a phone call in a minute. Whoops, okay. Yeah, can you go to the next or the first slide? Yeah, so I just want to give a disclaimer. Let me go back to the disclaimer. These are just my interpretations thus far as I've been reading the NTIA, like Diane, I've read it a couple times, trying to get through it. These are not the opinions of the Colorado Attorney General or the Colorado Broadband Office. My counsel to you would be to talk to your counsel, potentially in your Attorney General's office if you're a state rep. Also, if you're in the state, contact your NTIA rep. They're the ones who really know the ins and outs of the CIA process and the BEAD challenge process. So next slide. So as Diane said and others have said, all the states are preparing their initial proposal. In the initial proposal, the NTIA broke it apart into two groups. The first part is, I believe it's sections 3, 5, 6, and 7 of 19. And then there's a total 19 you have to answer by the time you get to your final proposal. But you can, the first part, the initial proposal is chunked into two. Question 6 is the community anchor question. And I'm not going to read this to you, but it just describes exactly what you're supposed to be putting into your initial proposal. So go to the next slide. So Diane explained a little bit about what New Mexico is doing. Colorado, similar. We were in a little bit different position. Colorado Broadband Office has been around since I believe around 2014. We have a map. We've been giving out state grants for quite some time. So we had a little bit of a head start here. As a matter of fact, Colorado even has a definition of community anchor institution in our statutory rules. So we already had that. And then the IAJA sets out, they also have a definition for community anchor institution, which you can use. And if you go, on that prior side, it shows that if you want to change that definition, you can, and then you have to go through a process. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll show you what Colorado did. The black lining there, that's basically the standard definition from the IIJA. What Colorado chose to do, well, we're still in the drafting mode here, but we wanted to add a couple. One was correctional facilities. Correctional facilities were hard to cover. In the Capital Projects Fund, if any of you are participating in that, the grantees who can apply for capital projects cannot be state agencies. You can be a municipality, lower levels of government. You can be a nonprofit. You can be an ISP. But the state agencies were not included, at least in the Colorado program as we set it up. And the correctional facilities have contacted us several times about getting grant money. And we think it's important to connect those facilities. You connect a lot of people who are in a vulnerable population, as they describe it, And it's actually there in section H, the vulnerable populations, including low income, unemployed, children. And then, they do actually explicitly list incarcerated. So that is part of the vulnerable population we're trying to give access to broadband. So we added that one explicitly. And then the other one was government office. That was not included in the standard definition, but we believe, at least in Colorado, that there are government offices where the population gathers, including vulnerable populations. And some of them already have broadband. They may not have broadband at 1 gig, but we wanted to include them explicitly and take a look at them. So we kind of mashed the two definitions together, and that's what we came up with. Next slide. So we kind of kept this to a minimum, and other states might think about this. We wanted to keep the modification to the federal definition to a minimum, because for each of the added CAIs, if you want to add a category, or you can drop one if you want, but you have to justify that as well. But for each added CAI, you have to explicitly come up with verbiage, narrative of why you think that should be added and how you think that's going to provide for greater, the quote there is, greater use of broadband by vulnerable populations. So you have to come up with a narrative to how that is going, your addition is going to address that. So my suggestion here is, I think we're doing a lot of community outreach to the public. We are talking to state agencies, including the Colorado Department of Corrections, who has already given us input. To Diane's point, we need to talk to the tribal territories, and then just do some surveys or assess need. So we're kind of in the process of doing that to support those two added CAIs that we are intending to add. Next slide. And then just as a general proposition, there's quite a few sources that you can use, and I believe we'll probably be giving these slides out later. So you'll have all these links here. These are just other links. I'm sure there's similar links in other states that are similar to the Department of Education or OIT for Colorado. We were on a call yesterday with NTIA. They actually mentioned that very first link there, the Department of Homeland Security Infrastructure Foundation. There is some information in there that would guide you or get you down to the CAIs. So I think our mapping folks, who do a wonderful job, they're using all of these resources. We will have public comments come in. We have to come up with our definition and actually populate a CSV file, Excel spreadsheet basically. But I think under the public comment period on the initial proposal, we'll probably get more input and can add or drop CAIs, and then certainly during the challenge process, we'll add or drop CAIs. And then the tribal input. So we're still looking for that to get more tribal input. Next slide. So I had a title, I think, on this slide originally, maybe fell off, but it's a little unfortunate, at least for CAIs, is, and you see the quotation up there first, is you have to serve the unserved addresses, the underserved addresses, and then, and only then, you can drop down and serve the CAIs. So, and even in that situation, you've got to certify in your final proposal, if you are proposing to give money to CAIs and connect them at 1 gig, you have to certify in your proposal, your final proposal, that you will serve the unserved and the underserved first, then the CAIs. And then I was reading through the NOFO as well, found this kind of interesting. The NTIA, in their language of the NOFO, says they strongly urge states to use funds to address CAIs rather than non-deployment eligible uses. So it's not, even if you serve all the unserved and the underserved, you could use it for other things. There are some non-deployment eligible uses. You can use the money for digital equity. You can use the money for outreach and education. and just connecting other broadband uses, devices even. So it was interesting. They are on the list. You do have to identify them, but the NTIA strongly urges that you connect the CAIs ahead of at least your non-deployment eligible uses. So unfortunately, CAIs are third on the list, it looks like. So, but that's just the position, how they positioned it. Next slide. Yeah, so I think I put into the chat there the challenge process policy. It has a model challenge process as well. They did clarify some good things in the red line that came out. Some of it was just clarification, some of it was new additions. But of course, in the challenge process, the CAI can challenge that it meets the definition of a CAI. So if you missed a university or you missed a firehouse or whatever was your definition of CAI, that unmarked or unidentified CAI can say, no, I'm a CAI and here's why I qualify in your definition. The CAI may challenge the 1 gigabit designation by an ISP because an ISP may list in their information that they already serve it for 1 gigabit. And what was interesting is the NTIA will defer to the CAI for defining its service level. At houses and at businesses, we had to figure out what is your service at that location. Here, the NTIA says the state can rely on whatever the CAI says. And then when the CAI says, I am a CAI, here's my speeds, the burden shifts to the ISP to challenge that. And then there's a model challenge process narrative that you can cut and paste into your item 6 for your initial proposal. And I'll hurry up here because it sounds like looks like John's moving us along here. I think that's close to the last slide. Is there another slide? Yeah, and yeah, you have to use the current map when you start your challenge process. It depends on when people are challenging it. It can't be 60 days or older. You have to have if 60 days have passed, you have to go to the most current map for your challenge process. We're doing a little bit more of a deeper dive on an ISP under enforceable commitment. We opted into a module that'll say if you don't get a response, then the CBO may assume the locations are eligible. And then you can also look at the past performance of an ISP. So we're digging a little bit deeper on enforceable commitment under the federal funding. John brought that up. I think that individuals, you can give your challenge information to a local government or a nonprofit, but you can't file a challenge yourself. They just made that clear, but you have another avenue you can get to. And then, the challenge process, the FCC has their map. You can submit all that information to the FCC. In Colorado, we require whatever you submit to the FCC to also be sent to the CBO. So we're going to get a mirror copy of the FCC's map. And then it expands the challenge process to 120 days, but that's from soup to nuts. That's from the start of your challenge all the way to submission to the NTIA after resolving all your problems, or if you had problems or challenges. So the challenge window and the rebuttal have to be at least 14 days. The NTIA says they would recommend 30 days. In Colorado, we used the FCC map to do our capital projects fund, and we conducted a challenge. So we've already had quite a bit of challenges to the map. We resolved some of those and have already updated our map. So we may keep ours a little bit lower. I don't know what we're set yet for 14 days or 30, but that's the windows of what we're working with here. And I think that may be the last slide. Is that right? Yeah, so then I can hand it over to next speaker so we don't run out of time.
All right, thank you very much, Judd. I do want to pick up quickly on one of your comments that about connecting the unserved and underserved first before the anchor institutions. We've heard a different interpretation of that prioritization from NTIA. It's perhaps a small change, but significant. But NTIA told us that yes, anchor institutions are third in priority, but not necessarily later in time.
Yeah.
And And the idea is that maybe if you're building into a community, you can connect to the anchor institution first, if that's the way you're going to provide service to the unserved and underserved households. So that's kind of another way to enforce that language.
Yeah, and to be sure, I mean, another way too is if in your final or your initial proposal, you can come up with, you show and you certify you will meet the unserved and underserved, and you have money left over, then you can serve the CAIs, and then you're supposed to prioritize those CAIs, and you can start serving, you can start building out to them whenever you see fit, as long as your plan allows for that. So maybe
exactly.
a little bit, yes, as long as you can show that you've met the unserved and underserved, and you have budget left, then you can put that into your plan and go at it for right off the bat. Yep.
From the get-go. Yep, that's right. That's right. Okay, good. I'm glad you're hearing the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. We'll come back to you in the Q&A session, but now it's a great pleasure to turn things over to Shannon Williams-Mitchum. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and set up my screen share so I can start the presentation. All right. Here we go. All right, I think that this is viewable now. So wonderful. All right. So again, thanks for inviting me to join this great webinar. Really appreciate Shelby's work in helping the community understand these really nuanced guidelines so that we can make the most of this massive federal investment in broadband. My name is Shannon Williams-Mitchum. I'm the Vice President of Public-Private Partnerships at Ready. Prior to joining the company, I was an appointee at NTIA. I worked in the Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives, managing the Connecting Minority Communities program. And prior to that, I worked at another U.S. Department of Commerce agency called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I have some experience on the federal side, watching the sausages being made, so to speak, and have a keen eye on some of the nuances of this. But I just am honored to be a part of such a relevant and important discussion with experts who have been in this field for quite some time, and excited to learn more from you all and the discussion here today about the nuances of these rules. But I'm going to share Ready's take on this in support of our state broadband office clients. I'll start with, we've already talked a lot about the BEAD program, but I think it's worth reiterating some of the guidance and just taking a big picture view at how unique this program is, and how it's an unprecedented opportunity for us to close the digital divide. If I had to summarize some of the unique parts of this program, I'd say three things. One, it's massive, right, in size and scope. We know that. It's data-driven. Grant allocations are driven by the data on unserved and underserved locations, but then of course it's complicated, right? So there's a lot of detailed and nuanced federal oversight, a lot of very nuanced and complex guidelines that states need to enact. But I think overall we can appreciate that the goal really is to get service to everyone in the country, and hopefully by using a data-driven approach and having all hands on deck, including private sector partners like our company, Ready.net, we can help facilitate making that process a little bit easier. I also forgot to mention that broadband.money, some audience members might have heard of that brand. This is the company that had created broadband.money to assist with getting local providers and communities access to broadband funding. And we're a startup, we're a tech company with data engineers and software engineers that really tries to create customized solutions to make it easier to address the requirements of these federal programs, and use our integrated data mapping platform to build these software solutions to facilitate these processes. And I'll go a little bit more into detail in later slides, but again, it's worth reiterating BEAD's guidelines on community anchor institutions. So as was stated earlier, NTIA does underscore a preference for eligible entities to ensure that community anchor institutions have gigabit connectivity. Although it sounds like there's some questions about, in terms of priority, where addressing CAIs service needs falls in addressing the other requirements of the program. But I do want to point out and note that in the BEAD NOFO's definition for an eligible community anchor institution, it's a little bit unique in how they define CAIs versus unserved and underserved locations, because in the definition in the NOFO, for those, it expressly states that they have to be identified on the National Broadband Map, so the FCC's fabric map, whereas with eligible CAIs, it doesn't explicitly say that. So that's something we can discuss and maybe perhaps get some additional guidance on NTIA. But my understanding is that NTIA's intent is for states to utilize the state challenge process and their initial proposal to identify which of those community anchor institutions are eligible per the BEAD guidelines, and then use the state challenge process to help validate the service designations for that list. And so I just have some excerpts from the challenge process and the initial proposal process guidance. Again, CAI lists are required for initial proposal volume 1. You have to use a standardized criteria. You need to do outreach and engagement to verify those CAI listings. And having all this stuff done sooner rather than later is what we're recommending our clients do to help ease and aid the state challenge process once that window opens. So this is just an overview of the general approach that we've been recommending, assembling and verifying the list, and really appreciate hearing the nuances of that process from our previous speakers, trying to gather all these lists and integrate them into a mapping platform so that it's easier to visualize and analyze where we can start to deploy these grant awards in accordance with NTIA guidance. But generally, we're hoping to develop a means to allow the verification of the community anchor institution list in a more automated and streamlined way as a precursor to the state challenge process coordinator tool that we have been implementing in some of our states. And again, I'll show a little preview of some of those tools in later slides. And as I mentioned, at the core of a lot of our solutions is this geospatial platform, a map, where we're integrating existing public data sources as well as licensed data sources. We utilize something called the Ready Strength Rank and the Ready Address Database, which are proprietary algorithm-based data points that we also make available on our platform so that our customers are able to visualize the different approaches to assessing broadband need in an easy to use and a user-friendly way. And ultimately, we hope to assist our customers to be the bridge to not only providers, municipal, local governments, and tribes, but also community anchor institutions. And this is an overview of the steps that we are taking with our clients to help meet these NTI requirements in advance of the state challenge process. So obtaining and integrating these lists, reviewing and cleaning them, as I'm sure other speakers are familiar with some of the discrepancies that might be present in the different lists that aren't standardized. We work with our clients to clean and standardize those lists so that they are easy to map and visualize on our tool. And then working through our other tools, the performance test and survey, which I'll talk about, to assess connectivity in accordance with the NTIA standards for gathering evidence to assess broadband need, ultimately to mobilize CAIs to participate and the challenge processes when they open in a more streamlined way. And so I'm going to share my contact information in case anyone's interested in doing like a more in-depth demo, but what you see here is a video of our mapping platform. On the left, you see that we have a community anchor institution, it'll loop again, mapping layer, which layers onto all of the other data and content that we have about broadband service needs. You can export all of the information about the CAIs. The baseline definition that we use is NTIA's definition, and we parse out the categories under NTIA's definition for our customers to view. You can export address information, so that you can better target and do marketing or gather additional evidence. There's a whole host of tools that our customers use to help facilitate the CAI process, in addition to our existing points of interest data that can be compared and contrast to address any discrepancies and make sure that the list is as comprehensive as possible. And then once, those CAIs are identified and we have, information about their level of need or connectivity, if you need to gather additional proof, we allow the deployment of performance test and survey. We also call this the Community Broadband Toolkit, which is integrated into the platform and utilize 3 broadband tests in accordance with NTIA guidance on performance test evidence. And all of that is integrated into the mapping platform as well. And this is just a quick demo of what that looks like, because it's the speed test and also a qualitative survey that can also assist with more data gathering efforts that can be customized for our customers' needs. And this is just an example of our work with the state of Mississippi, where they have customize the community broadband kit for their purposes. And you see, it says, "Are you tired of slow internet?" That is the page where you test your internet. And because we haven't started the BEAD implementation work, we work mostly with them on capital projects fund. But this screenshot is of their public facing platform. There's a public facing and an admin platform, all of which can be customized for your purposes. And we'll be adapting the Capital Projects Fund challenge process to the BEAD process in service of our work with Mississippi, Indiana, Kansas, and soon Virginia and some other states in the coming weeks. So this is just a brief video of the challenge process coordinator, which again, we're hoping to launch a portal to assist with CAI verification as a precursor to the challenge process. And I see John joining it. I guess I can jump to my final slide, which is, I think from Ready's standpoint, we encourage community anchors to just ask state broad offices, like, what will your legacy be, right? We have a massive opportunity really to successfully bridge the digital divide. And I think all of us would prefer it to be based in precision, objectivity, confidence, and results that are defensible rather than what's the status quo, like politics and subjectivity. So that's really what Rady's goal is, to help facilitate that as best as possible. And I have a great team that helped with this helps with this process and this presentation, but happy to take any questions and email me if you'd like more information about what we do. Right, thank you.
All right, great, Shannon. Thank you so much. So we just have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists to be sort of do rapid fire questions, rapid fire answers to my questions, so we can get handle as many as possible. So Shannon, just starting with you first. So who would hire you and Ready.net? Are you open to be hired by a state, or would community anchor institutions themselves hire you to do this mapping work?
Both. We serve state broadband offices as well as community anchor institutions, nonprofits, local governments. Of course, the way we structure the engagement varies depending on the needs of the organization. State broadband offices much more comprehensive. but we offer access to our mapping tools to virtually any organization that's interested.
Very good. And have you compiled this information about the location and broadband availability for anchor institutions around the whole country in every state?
Yes, we have already gathered all of this data across the entire United States and territories, and it can be made available to anyone who's interested.
All right.
Yep.
Very impressive. Very good. Thanks for sharing that tool with us. Quickly back to Diane and Judd. You both had slides identifying the definition of anchor institutions, and you provided some really helpful examples of what you consider anchor institutions. Could you, each of you, provide us some examples of institutions that you do not consider an anchor institution? And the reason I ask is that I was in conversation with someone from NTIA a few months ago, and he said, well, John, if you make the definition of anchor institution too broad, then it becomes meaningless. So what are the boundaries? What would you consider not an anchor institution in your view?
So I've been watching some of the initial proposals as they come in the door. West Virginia or Virginia, I think, just got theirs in. Louisiana was also very, very quick to get theirs in. So I've been curious to see what they've been doing with the definition of CAI. So the Virginia one that came in, they included houses of worship, and they provided a justification for it. A whole paragraph. Again, you have to show that it increases broadband usage for vulnerable populations. We have not. So there's one that we didn't consider that one. The NTIA does not have that in their model definition either, but there's one where some states may choose to expand that. We chose to expand it in other areas, but you're right. You have to be judicious, I think, about where you define them. Remember, these are getting 1 gig service, and they have to get 1 gig service. So it's not just building out a neighborhood with 100 symmetricals. So you have to figure out where that line is in your definitions.
Interesting. Well, I see, Diane, if I remember, you did consider houses of worship to be an anchor institution, right? Did you say, but are there any that you said no to?
There are some that we said no to from our brainstorming session. Of course, New Mexico has not finalized their list of definitions yet. But we did say no to bars, and we said no to residences, even though we have in some of our smaller towns. I grew up in a small town in New Mexico, and we have family get-togethers that are hundreds of people at a time, but that's usually a reunion. That's usually once a year. So residences and bars were not considered, but we tried to stay very open because of the very diverse cultures and the very diverse makeup of our communities, from so very rural to somewhat urban. Compared to the East Coast and the West Coast, we're not urban, but Albuquerque does have about 2 million people. So we did try to make sure that it includes everybody.
Gotcha. And back to both of you, how about private sector doctors' offices? So the hospitals, yes. The rural health clinics, yes. But what about private doctors' offices?
I don't think we've included those. Again, we're in the phase of defining it as well, but I don't think we've included those. Those could be included under a business, though, and get 100 symmetrical. If you start mapping out every doctor's office across the state of Colorado, that's going to be quite a bit. I understand the medical need, for maybe imaging and remote telehealth. But I don't think we've included those, although the bars also need high-speed internet for those sporting games.
So John, I would say we debated the difference between need and want. So there was that. And John, to your question on doctor's offices, we had a split. The doctor's offices that are in the medical buildings that are close to or attached to hospitals and medical centers, we're considering those. Doctors' offices that are standalone or away from other medical facilities, then we consider those to be businesses. So
Gotcha.
that's where we split it then. Now, I don't know how the final definition will come out. We may just split doctors' offices out completely. I don't know.
Good deal. And back to Shannon, do you have a standard list of anchor institutions that you considered in putting your platform together, Shannon?
So we use the NTIA definition or their categories as a starting point that's already available on our mapping platform. And what we do is we customize it based on the input that we receive from our state customers, right? So beyond what the NTIA is required, we don't have a standard means. We prefer to leave that up to the states to determine it. I mean, you can hear just in this presentation how drastically different the approaches might be, where they have like a statutory requirement for what a CAI is versus a state that may not have any conception of that. I think what we try to do is facilitate conversations where they're getting the appropriate input to make these determinations, and that they're, tapping into municipal governments and other organizations that have verifiable listings that they can use and include in addition to our initial cut at it. But it's data, it's never perfect, right? And so the process of working with them and providing that technical support to validate, I think, is where we try to put up most of our focus.
Very good, very good. And Diane, back to you. We had a good question in the Q&A box about the New Mexico broadband map. And did you create that map on your own, or did you work off of the FCC's national broadband map when creating the New Mexico map?
So that map was, we worked off of the FCC map, and we used the FCC map to challenge the FCC map. And so New Mexico has had a broadband map for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. It was not accurate, and it was essentially the FCC map. So we've used that for quite a few years. I think we used it for the other NTIA broadband programs in the past. But what we've done this time is we've made that extra effort and brought in a team of experts led by our state GIO, who is herself an expert and just a tremendously, accomplished person in GIS and data analysis. So we're very, very lucky as a state to have her with us and to have her working for the state. So she has layered all kinds of information on it, in addition to what we see as unserved and underserved and served. We also have the CAIs. We have all of the federal funded broadband projects on different layers according to where the funding, which program the funding comes from. And we have the state funded broadband projects on other layers as well. So that when you put all the layers together, our ISPs, our municipalities and counties, and our state office can see exactly where broadband exists now, where fiber exists, where fixed wireless exists, where DSL exists, where copper exists, and then where projects are going in, and then where the areas for unserved and underserved exist for the BEAD funding.
Very good. And Diane, does your maps use speed tests as part of the data that you collect in producing your state broadband map?
They are using speed tests. We do use that. We use a lot of different sources for the data that we have, and UCLA is one of the major sources that we use, not only their speed tests, but other forms of their data that we use. So we, I believe, have joined this century in gathering our data and use multiple sources.
Very good. And one last question for Judd. I think a question has come up about whether an anchor institution could be fit into the category of an unserved or underserved location. Is that possible?
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a SBLN meeting yesterday, and somebody brought that up. Couldn't you just shoehorn a CAI into your businesses? And there was a debate. There was pros and cons of doing that. It seemed like, you know, if you shove it into a business category, you would provide it 100 symmetrical service. It's not going to get the gig service that it's entitled to if it was a fully fleshed out CIA. But you know, if your state funds don't look like they're going to be able to cover CAIs, which I think a lot of states are really only going to be covered, they're unserved. Maybe there's underserved, maybe not even all of those, and then you know the CAIs may get left behind. Someone said you could consider putting them in as a business, so they'd get 100 symmetrical at least. So there's pros and cons to doing that. It kind of depends on the state.
Gotcha. Well, that's a very interesting question. So we're going to explore that further going forward. But unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time today. I really appreciate everybody's questions and comments and the expertise that you've shared. Just as a reminder, Shelby is a membership organization, and we provide these webinars free of charge to the general public, but we would love for you to become a Shelby member if you're not currently a Shelby member. We have over 320 members from around the United States, but we're always looking to grow and be of better service to the anchor institutions. So feel free to take a look at our membership page there. The link is in front of you. And also we have our AnchorNets conference coming up, annual conference coming up on October 10th through the 12th, where we'll be able to dig into these issues in even more granular detail. So we hope that you can join us in person. We're expecting about 400 people to attend our conference this year. So we're very excited about that and hope that you can join us there. So with that, that concludes. Just as a reminder, our webinar is available, will be available on the website, and we will make the slides available as well. And thank you so much for joining this webinar. I hope it was helpful, and please let us know how we can do these better in the future. So thank you all very much. Bye-bye.